Hello, and welcome back to the Cincy Reformed Podcast. My name is Zac Wise. I'm with Brandon Burks over here. We are co-pastors of Westside Reformed Church in Cincinnati, Ohio, part of the Dutch Reformed tradition, although neither of us are Dutch. And we are coming to you today to speak a little bit about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, because just a couple of days ago we celebrated Easter Sunday, and so we thought it might be fruitful to have a conversation with you about the resurrection of Jesus and some of the reasons why we believe that there was, in fact, historical, bodily resurrection of Christ. We hope this might be beneficial to you Christians who are tuning into this, to think about why it is that we believe that Jesus rose from the dead bodily, but also if you have some conversations with family or friends who might not be a believer in Christ, then perhaps this might help you to advance some of those conversations. So I'll kick it off. I think probably the thing that I personally find to be very persuasive about the resurrection is just the transformation of the disciples that you see within the New Testament narrative. We see that the disciples are very slow to understand before the crucifixion and resurrection. We see that they are doubting. We see how they are unfaithful to Jesus. He spent so much time with them, teaching them. He befriended them. And then in his time of greatest turmoil and stress, they just abandoned him because they did not want to be associated with a man who was under trial. And so they deserted him. And then all of a sudden you find later on in the narrative of the Bible that they are boldly proclaiming the message of Jesus Christ, that they are boldly aligning themselves with him and even welcoming martyrdom because they refused to reject and deny the message. And the message that they were, that compelled them was the message of the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. So I think that transformation of the disciples is very persuasive. Brandon, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, so obviously that is, I think, a very big one. People who were so willing to run away and deny Jesus at times, to flee, to abandon Christ, are now going to their death and proclaiming it. But also, if you look at the narrative of what happened, there's just some key things that if this were a made-up story, you wouldn't do. For example, if this was a made-up story, you would not have women finding the tomb, the empty tomb. Part of that is because back in those days, a woman's testimony could not be heard in court. They had different views of gender in terms of what women were able to do in the civil sphere. And that was they were not allowed to give testimony in court. In fact, one of the texts that was written by a rabbi during that time said, "Sooner let the words of the law be burned than delivered to a woman." It kind of shows how they viewed women. I think it shows how they viewed testimony. And so if you're back in this day with that kind of understanding of women and their role and what they can testify to in a court of law, if you're back in that day and you're going to make up a story about the resurrected Christ, the last people that I would have in my made-up story finding the empty tomb is women in that case. So I think that the fact that women found the tomb is great evidence that the tomb was indeed actually empty, because you would not make it up in that way. You also see a lot of witnesses. I mean, Paul talks about how there were 500 people who reported to have seen the risen Christ in 1 Corinthians 15:6. And so there were many people who were testifying to those events as Christ was being manifested in different places, appearing in different places, talking with different people. And so it wasn't an isolated event that was he only showed himself to a couple people, but he showed himself over and over and over again to many people, and many people could attest that that actually did happen. Zach, you have some more?
Yeah, I think that, similar to the one that I said a little bit ago about the transformation of the disciples, I think that along a similar vein, you see certain characters within the biblical story undergo a conversion from clear unbelief to belief. And these conversions were recorded and narrated in a time when these very same people could have denied it, but they didn't. So we think about people like the Greco-Roman centurion, who was the executioner at the foot of the cross, who then undergoes a miraculous conversion at the foot of the cross, seeing him die, and declared truly this was the Son of God. We might think as well about the brother of Jesus, who had doubted him, had denied him, had called him mad, James, I'm speaking of, until sometime after his resurrection, where James met Jesus. And we might think about Paul also, who met Jesus as he was in the process of persecuting Christians. Then he met Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, was given a vision of him, was addressed by him, was summoned by Jesus to leave that life of persecution and Judaism behind, and he became if we could call it, the chief follower of Jesus at that point, the chief missionary of Jesus. And this amazed the watching world because they all knew who Paul was. He was a trained scholar in the scriptures, and he became a great proclaimer and defender of Christ.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, as we look back at the text, as we look back at the narrative, we see there's just so much internal evidence, going back to the women finding the tomb, but also the response of the Jews. The response of the Jews back in that day wasn't, no, he wasn't taken, the body's here. No, the response of the Sanhedrin was, well, the body was stolen. Or, they were making up tales to try to explain away the empty tomb, which presupposes the tomb was indeed empty. And the Sanhedrin affirmed it. So the Jewish response to the empty tomb actually gives evidence for the empty tomb. And also the fact that these writings were being written very early on. So, obviously there were a lot of reports that were orally going around, but the Gospel of Mark was written, they think, scholars think, in the AD 50s. I mean, that's very early on, less than or perhaps 20 years after Jesus died and rose again. And so people who were alive during that time were also alive during the writing of these events, and they could have clarified if these writings were fictitious, if these writings were false. They could have been put down by the actual eyewitnesses, but no, I mean, these writings were written early on during a time where the eyewitnesses to all of these events were alive and then affirmed by those eyewitnesses. Did you have anything else to add to that, Zach?
Yeah, I think that as we think about the history and the phenomenon of Christianity, we think about a covenantal movement that we believe is organically connected with the Old Testament people, but something still unique about that, and that this unique New Covenant movement of following Jesus as the Messiah, it completely overtook the known world at the time and spread. And this was a somewhat outlawed faith. This was not, these are not the richest people, the most powerful people, the most learned people, yet this message is spread like wildfire. And once you get finally to the 4th century, you have it to be allowable by Constantine. But up until then, it's spreading like mad. And what explains this incredible spread of Christianity? Well, the resurrection surely is the thing that best explains that spread, especially at a time where, as you just mentioned, Brandon, this could have been contested, it could have been falsified, it could have been debated, but we don't see that in the ancient texts whatsoever.
Yeah, for sure. We also have a few other things too, just from history and what scholars and historians tell us. They talk about how during this first century kind of era, resurrection was not like a commonplace thing that everybody was talking about. It wasn't like all these pagan religions were all talking about it, and it was like this big idea at the time. It was kind of an intrusion event in terms of what the other religions and things were doing at the time. So it was kind of a unique event that happened. Now, obviously, the Old Testament was talking about resurrection and pointing to Christ's resurrection. But given the climate of the first century time, it wasn't as though Christians were just making something up that was kind of common folklore of the day or something like that. We also see evidence or writings about the resurrection from non-biblical sources, which I think is interesting. How other people of different religions or different faiths were writing. Different historians, for example, Josephus is an early historian, and he was writing about Jesus. And here's what he said. He said, "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he wrought surprising feats. On the third day he appeared, restored to life, and the tribe of Christians has not disappeared." So he talks about how Jesus died, rose, and kind of based upon this, the tribe of Christians have not disappeared. Kind of going back to what Zac said, it kind of kicked off the spreading of Christianity.
Yeah, that's helpful stuff. I think maybe it might be worthwhile to just discuss some of the theories that people have advanced to try to explain away the reality of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so I'm going to kick that over to Brandon. Explain to us maybe what these theories are and maybe how you might respond to them.
Sure. Yeah, there's, I would say, about 4 big main theories that people throughout the years have tried to explain away the empty tomb. They've tried to explain away the resurrection of Christ. One theory is called the swoon theory. And it's the idea Jesus didn't actually die. He looked dead. He was swooned. He was in shock because he lost all of this blood. He was beaten, and so he hung on the cross, lifeless. They thought he was dead, so they took him down, placed him in the tomb, and as he was laying in the tomb, perhaps the cool air of the tomb revived him, and he walked out. Now, a couple problems with this theory is, one, he was pronounced dead. The soldiers pronounced him dead. Nicodemus and Joseph were pronouncing him dead. And the Roman soldiers were good at putting people to death. I think that they knew if somebody was dead or not dead, that was kind of their thing. They killed criminals on the cross, and they knew when it was time to take them down. They knew when they died. They knew when it was time to break legs, and so on and so forth. And so I don't think that everybody got the diagnosis or the prognosis wrong regarding the death of Christ. Also, his injuries were just beyond the ability to recover from in terms of the spear in the side and the beatings and everything else. I mean, just from a medical standpoint, I just find it not likely that he recovered from those injuries, and especially recovered from them alone in an empty tomb, where he somehow unraveled himself of all of his grave cloths that were filled with pounds of spices, and then unrolled a tomb away and slipped out without the guards finding him. I just don't see that as being very persuasive.
And then to inspire all of your followers who abandoned you, that, hey, although I'm a bloody mess right now, I really was dead and came back to life, and now I'm a glorious reigning king. Go die for me.
I mean,
seems a bit of a stretch.
His injuries, I mean, he would have been quite a mess for quite some months recovering. The whole thing is just not persuasive. The second theory is that the disciples stole the body, the theft theory. Disciples came in, stole the body. Part of the problem with that is the tomb was guarded for that exact reason. That's why they put a guard in front of the tomb. And if that soldier lost the body on his watch, it could be his head. He's going to watch the tomb. And also the disciples they're grieving during this time. They're in a state of almost despair. Some have given up all hope. Some were just didn't believe anymore. Right. Thomas, he just didn't even believe. So these are not the people that are going to do like grave robbery. These are the people who have said, well, it's kind of all done with and we're going to move on. And so I don't find the theft theory...
I'm going to jump on that too again.
Very persuasive.
Again, if you steal the body, that means you know he was dead, didn't come back to life. And then you're going to go out and give your life for a lie, right? That just makes... That's not persuasive, like you said.
It's not persuasive. If you know that you made up a story, are you going to die for the truthfulness of your made up story? No. And even if you're psychotic enough to do so, 11 of you probably are not going to do as 11 of the disciples went to their martyrdom defending the risen Christ and proclaiming the gospel. A third theory is kind of bizarre. That's the hallucination theory, that all the hundreds of people that saw Jesus were all hallucinating. Every single one of them. Mass hallucinations, because they were all in this state of mind where it was conducive to hallucinate, and that's what they did. The problem with that is, one, that's just not persuasive. There were way too many sightings, hundreds of sightings of Jesus, and they were all in different states of mind. Some were grieving, some, like Peter, I think he had a lot of guilt perhaps. You had some who were just kind of carrying on with their normal tasks. Some were not believing anymore. So you had varying states of mind. I don't think that mass hallucination is something that is persuasive either. And the final theory is the wrong tomb theory. They went to the wrong tomb and said, oops. The problem with that is less than 72 hours earlier, they were at that tomb, and they knew where it was. It's also unpersuasive because if the disciples said, hey, Jesus rose again from the dead, the Sanhedrin could have gone to the right tomb, showed them the body, and said, the body's right here. And if they produced the body of Jesus, that would have just squashed Christianity right then and there. It wouldn't have gone anywhere. But the fact that they didn't do that, in fact, the Sanhedrin did the opposite by affirming that, yes, this is his tomb and it is empty, and they're trying to spin other theories, shows that it was indeed empty. And so again, I think we go back to what the Bible tells us. And the Bible is the Word of God. The Bible is without error. God cannot lie. And I think one of the greatest evidences that we have is that it's been given to us by testimony from God to us, and it is reliable. And as I mentioned in a previous podcast, without the Bible, we are intellectually, spiritually, and morally bankrupt. And we have a lot of problems if we're starting to discredit or not believe every word of Scripture. So those are some of the reasons why, some evidence for the resurrection, some of the false beliefs about the resurrection. But Zac, if kind of approaching it more pastorally, if somebody came to you and said, but why is the resurrection that big of a deal? Why should I care about it? How does it factor into my life? What would you say?
I can't really improve upon the statements of our Heidelberg Catechism on this one. So Lord's Day 17, question 45 asks, how does Christ's resurrection benefit us? And it gives three things in the answer. It says, first, by his resurrection, he has overcome death so that he might make us share in the righteousness he obtained for us by his death. So that refers to our status of being justified before him, that this is one of the great benefits. The second is by his power, we too are already raised to a new life. And then third, Christ's resurrection is a sure pledge to us of our blessed resurrection. And so the resurrection of Jesus is of immense importance for both the present and the future, and also the past, covering our past sins, our present sins, our future sins, by giving us life now that continues into the life to come, to raise us up and to assure us that we have that everlasting inheritance because we're joined to Christ. And being joined to Christ means that he's going to gather us to himself on that last day. And that because our head is in heaven, well, the body is going to be in heaven. Yeah. And that we will rejoice with Christ in that glorious new creation when he returns. So it's hard to overstate, I don't think you can overstate the importance of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And surely this is why we as Christians are bold about spreading the gospel, why we have great hope in the face of a time of death counts and so forth. Yet we endure all these things with great hope and expectation because Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Yeah, well, thank you for joining us today for this episode of Cincy Reformed. You can visit us at cincyreformed.org. Our church is Westside Reformed Church, westsidereformed.org. We'd love to have you worship with us. We worship at 10 o'clock on Cincinnati's West Side each and every Sunday. And we hope you join us again in the future for our upcoming episodes of the Cincy Reformed podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. Bye-bye.